It doesn't even list the other readings for this week, for this.
Oh, I just tore that particular thing in.
I know, but I mean,
Yeah. The rest of them are Russian. They have the extras and they don't.
whatever.
All right. Good evening. I'm Father James Blomley, and we are here at St. Nicholas Church today. We're beginning a study of the letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians. And so Ephesians is a fairly short book. It's only got 6 chapters. And it's something, but it's a good book. It's one that when we think about, a lot of times people remember verses out of Ephesians, and it becomes something that a lot of people think a lot of. And so we're going to be doing this, and in all honesty, we haven't done that many studies of St. Paul's letters here. We've done a lot of things, but for some reason, we've never really spent too much time on that. So this is the beginning of one. We'll start with this one, and as time goes on, we're going to be talking about other studies as well, of other books as well, letters of St. Paul, because they are important. And an incredible amount of theology, of Christian theology, is found within the letters of St. Paul. And so this is going to be the start. Over time, we'll be going and proceeding through a lot of the other ones and studying these things. And I think it'll be for a lot of benefit. This letter to the Ephesians, as I said, is pretty short. It's only 6 chapters. And so the way that we're going to approach it is tonight, we're going to talk about 2 major things about it. First of all, we're going to talk about the history of the book. You know, where is Ephesus, and when was St. Paul there, and how many times was he there? When did he write this letter to the Ephesians? And we're going to talk about this. This is always, no matter what you're talking about, when people are struggling with anything that's in Scripture, the issue of who wrote it and when did they write it and why did they write it really becomes very essential. And it becomes really fertile ground for people to kind of insert their own thoughts and their own beliefs, which is the second thing we're going to do tonight, is to talk about the Orthodox way of really being able to study and to learn what is being taught and what is being said in these letters. What sources are there, and how do we recognize a good source? How do we recognize something that is reliable as opposed to something that may not be particularly reliable at all? So we're also going to talk about that this evening as well. So what do we have then? Well, let's talk about these historical issues first. You know, as far as it goes, first of all, there's no question that St. Paul wrote this. I don't think anybody disputes that. Certainly nobody in the ancient world, all the commentators, all the people that wrote about it and studied it and taught out of this book, it was simply a foregone conclusion that this was Paul that had done that. And if we think of it, we have a pretty fair idea of when Paul was in Ephesus. He was there on 2 or 3 occasions. The first time that Paul came to Ephesus, and Ephesus was kind of a seacoast city. It was a little bit inland on a river, but it was a seacoast city in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. And so it was a bustling city. There was a lot of commerce going on. There was a lot of trade. It was known primarily, in a lot of ways, because of its fervent worship of the goddess Artemis. And there was a temple there to Artemis. There was a lot of money that was involved with the worship of Artemis that would go around. Many of the people tended to be superstitious. They would go around town, they'd be wearing something around their neck, sometimes a scroll, which was meant as to ward off evil, you know, the evil eye or whatever, curses. And people would walk around the city with those things on them. And so there are a lot of believers there. And we also know that later on, this whole temple of Artemis became a real problem, because one way that a lot of people made a lot of money in that town was to make little statues. They had a big statue of Artemis in the temple itself, but there was a really bustling trade, and people buying these little statues to take home, right? And so this became a part of what all was going on within Ephesus itself. Now, when Paul first got there, though the whole city was not pagan, there was a Jewish community, and there was a synagogue, maybe more than one, but there was certainly a Jewish community. And so, of course, it makes sense that he would go and he would begin his preaching just like he always did, by going to the synagogue. He did that everywhere he went, it seems. Now, when he first got there, as I say, it was on his way back to Jerusalem on his second missionary trip. And as part of that, he came to Ephesus. He was accompanied at that time by Priscilla and Aquila, who were aiding him and helping him in the mission that he had. And so when he comes there, he goes, he preaches. We understand that this would have been somewhere around AD 54, thereabouts, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And so when he's going home, what he was really interested in doing, he was going back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Actually for the Feast of Pentecost, all good Jews were supposed to be back in Jerusalem. And so Paul, even though he's obviously a Christian at this point in time, he wanted to be at Jerusalem for this feast. He wanted to be there. It's something he was used to doing. His own thinking had certainly changed by this time. But for him, there would have been a lot, if nothing else, a lot of attachment to this particular holiday, this particular festival that's there. So he's in a little bit of a hurry. He spends a little bit of time in Ephesus, and then he leaves Priscilla and Aquila, and he goes on to Jerusalem, but he does some teaching there. And so he goes on to Jerusalem, and Priscilla and Aquila are still there, and it's not too long after that they're joined by a very learned Jew from Alexandria, Egypt, known as Apollos. Now, Apollos, we kind of run into every once in a while. In fact, in another letter Paul writes, he's chiding some people about, they're saying my baptism is better than your baptism. And he says something to the effect that some say the baptism of Apollos is better, and some say the baptism of Paul, and some say the baptism of somebody else. And what he's saying is that it's foolish to say that. But the interesting thing about Apollos at this point in time was that he was not fully catechized, would be the thought, I guess. He was baptizing people, but he was giving them the baptism of John as opposed to the baptism of Christ. And so, but he stayed there. He was a very, very learned man. And he continued at least the preaching, and more people started to come along. And Priscilla and Aquila stayed there as well. And so when eventually Apollos did leave, he went to Corinth, where he was going to do the same thing there. And by the time that he left and the time that Paul returned after Pentecost and doing whatever he wanted to do or needed to do while he was in Jerusalem, when he got back to Ephesus, there were about a dozen or so people waiting on him that had been taught by Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. And when Paul came back, he gave them all the baptism of Christ. He did that for all of them. And that was certainly the beginning of the church in Ephesus. Later on, it's interesting, Ephesus is where the Apostle John ended up as time went on. Now, and Timothy, who we know from the letter to Timothy, was also the bishop of Ephesus for a good long time, until his death, we understand. After that, John lived in Ephesus or thereabouts. He became the bishop for a while. Eventually, he was exiled to Patmos, I think, to the Greek islands, where he had the vision that ended up being the Revelation. But so Ephesus kind of figures in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different things. So Paul comes back after that, and he, in fact, is at that point he's in kind of a hurry. He's on his third trip at this point, the third missionary trip. And so he has places that he wants to go and things that he wants to do, and so he stays to preach. And for the first 3 months that he was still there, he taught in the synagogue, which was his norm, and that's normally what he did. And so he taught in the synagogue, and he already had these 12 people that were a part of this. Priscilla and Aquila were still there. And then after 3 months, the hostility in the synagogue became really great. He ended up going to a school run by a local philosopher named Tyrannus. Now, there doesn't seem to be any indication that Tyrannus was a Christian, but he was letting Paul, if nothing else, he was letting Paul teach in the school that he had there. He was a local philosopher and teacher. That continued for about 2 years, and the church of Ephesus was really well established. And at that point, Paul goes ahead and he takes off. Well, when people started to look at the book of Ephesus, and remember the way in which these books were, they weren't published. It wasn't like everybody got a copy of these letters. Instead, like in this case, when Paul wrote the letter, it would be a letter. It would be something he wrote himself, and it would be taken there. Normally, Paul would deputize somebody. He'd ask somebody, please take this, Ephesus or Corinth or wherever. And so he would, and so there would be this direct connection between Paul and then between the recipients, in this case, the church of Ephesus. And so these letters would not immediately have gone to every other church. And instead, over time, as they became more and more valuable and people understood that there's a letter here and a letter there and a letter there, they would start to copy these letters, and they would slowly kind of distribute out. And this is the reason, really, why when we talk about having scripture in the church, and we're used to it, right? We have a gospel in the church. Everybody has a gospel in the church. Everybody has an apostole, the book with the readings from the epistles. I mean, it's just what we have. But in the early church, that was not so. The church might have something, might have a copy of a gospel, or might have a copy of a letter, but they would rely primarily upon the Old Testament. That would still be their primary go-to scripture, even though their teaching was still, we would recognize their teaching as something that we're familiar with. So the letter to Ephesus, of course, then goes to Ephesus, and it's sent there. But as I say, the real question is, it's not really a big dispute about him writing it. No, it's not a big dispute about when he was there, what he did while he was there, but there is a dispute or a disagreement, or really, it's less a disagreement than it is what a lot of people, it's hard to figure out when he wrote it. Because what we know is that at the time he wrote it, he was in prison. But Paul was in prison in like 3 different contexts. Shortly after leaving Ephesus that first time, he was imprisoned in Caesarea Palestine under Felix, who was the ruler out there at that point. And we understand that he was imprisoned by Felix in that part of the world for perhaps as long as 2 years. And he was there until he exercised his rights as a Roman citizen, and he appealed to the emperor in Rome. At that point, Felix let him go, and he went to Rome. Now, in Rome, he had 2 more periods of imprisonment. The first time was not that severe. The letters that we know that he wrote during that first period of imprisonment do not have, he does not refer to his martyrdom. Everything he wrote during that second period of imprisonment, he knew what was coming. And so when he wrote those letters, it would talk about his forthcoming death and about what was about to happen to him, and encourage people to continue on, even though this was what was going to happen. And he knew that that was going to be it. Well, most ancient commentators, and these include, of course, obviously St. John Chrysostom, include a number of other people, there's a general belief that Ephesus, or Ephesians rather, was written during the first Roman imprisonment, primarily because there is no reference to some forthcoming martyrdom. That probably better describes what happened during that upcoming, during that period of time. Now, oddly enough, and kind of jumping forward in time a lot, and this is something we'll kind of cover in a few minutes when we talk about sources and how we look at this and interpret these things. Saint Theophan the Recluse, the Russian saint, 19th century, was also interested in this. And that Archbishop of Verki, the late Archbishop of Verki, wrote a couple of books. One had to do, it's not an in-depth kind of thing, but it's a kind of book that you can read that will tell you a lot about all the different books and what their themes are and what they mean, and give you a good overview of it. And he did one of those for the Gospels. He did another one for the epistles. And so for Archbishop of Urki, St. Theophan was really one of his primary sources. He goes to St. Theophan a lot. And of course, St. Theophan is like, 17th, 18th centuries after all this. But that's okay. And we'll talk about why that's okay in just a few minutes. And so what St. Theophan believed was that he wrote this while he was imprisoned in Palestine by Felix during his very first imprisonment. And that would have been shortly after his first visit to Ephesus. And the reason that St. Theophan thought that was because in this letter, there's not a particular comment to the people in Ephesus about the church and about anything that might be going on in the church. That's a real common theme elsewhere in Corinthians in particular, but in other places where Paul, when he writes, he wants to, whatever else he says, he wants to address some problem, something that's come up that he's been told about or heard about, and he wants to try to straighten the people out about whatever it is that was going on. And because the Ephesians does not include that kind of thing, that is why St. Theophan believed, well, it's probably during that very first imprisonment. We don't know. The overwhelming, really early patristic consensus was during that first Roman imprisonment, but you can find these kind of opinions kind of all over the board. It's an interesting thing to think about. We like to know when Paul was doing stuff. And we know sometimes it's hard to pin Paul down. Paul is here, he's there, he's all over the place. He's a guy that moved around a lot, and it becomes, and because he's so respected, well, we really want to know. And so that's why there are these opinions about this. It doesn't mean that any of these people are wrong or ill-informed or mischievous or anything like that. This is just what, in fact, holy people believe, which is really kind of the focus on the second part of this that I want to talk about. And that's how to read any scripture, really, but in particular, all of the epistles. How do we interpret these things? When we look at them, how do we understand them? As Orthodox, our primary source for understanding things, if we're going to go and seek opinions and seek knowledge, is to go to the fathers of the church, the holy fathers of the church. And that covers a lot of ground. I mean, there are holy fathers to this very day. Think about St. Paisius, who taught a great deal. Think about some of the modern saints, St. Sophrony. All these people, this unbroken line of holy people, it continues on, and it will continue on until such time as the Lord returns. And so we'll always have holy people with us, but our normal course of doing these things has to do with looking back at the ancient fathers. Because we begin with that because that is where the church itself began. I mean, in the sense that these are the builders of the church, per se. And so when you look at that, when you look at a letter, an epistle, you look at a gospel, whatever it is that you're looking at, you start by looking at the sources. And that can be kind of daunting. I mean, if you look at the collected writings of just St. John Chrysostom, it's like, I saw it once. I had part of it. It's like 20 volumes in really fine print. It's real small. You could read forever on that stuff. And it'd be profitable to you to do that. But if you had a particular question in mind, then it doesn't really work quite as well for most of us. So there are some ways to go about this. And that is, you look for publications, you look for a book or of some kind put together by somebody that is reliable in the sense that they are fully Orthodox and that they aren't out, pushing an agenda. And there are several examples of that can be done. For example, the handout that I had today comes from there's a convent in a mesquite that accompanies it in Colorado. And they put out a lot of books. I think I got these books 15 or 20 years ago. I'm not sure if they're in publication anymore, but as far as the scripture goes, they put out a book which was the New Testament, with commentary on that accompanying it, and then they put out a book for the epistles and Revelation with the same kind of commentary. And so what I've done for the handout today is I went ahead and copied the endnotes for the book of Ephesians, and it'll give you some idea of how these people, when they're putting this together, what they looked for and what they're looking at, because it's more than just the words of the fathers. For example, if you look on this, for example, the very first endnote talks about, it's giving the title, right? It says, the Epistle of Paul, the Apostle to the Ephesians, italicized, and in those brackets over there, what they're talking about are different versions of Scripture, different manuscripts that they look at. One is the King James, and we know that's pretty commonly available. But some of these others are manuscripts that are in Constantinople and may or may not have ever been translated into English, may or may not have much get around much as far as people are concerned, people being familiar with these things. But for people that are trying to give the patristic opinion or view on the different things, these are resources that they look at. And so they look at whatever manuscripts they can look at in order to see variations between these manuscripts about the text. They don't look at anything, or I'm unaware of them looking at anything particularly modern. The King James may be about as modern as it gets. But when they do this, especially the manuscripts in Constantinople and elsewhere around the Orthodox world, they're worth looking at because of what they may or may not contain. But that's not the be-all and the end-all. They look at it and they'll point out whatever variations are there. But where it really becomes important starts with, with the next endnote. And then it goes on for close to 20 pages, or around 20 pages, I think, of endnotes on Ephesians, even though it's a fairly short book. And so what they do, whenever they find a place where somebody has had a commentary on that verse, or whatever is being said at that time, they make an endnote out of that. And so the second endnote, which is the first one has to do with the title, the second endnote quotes St. Hilary of Poitiers. The Jerome is underneath there. Chrysostom is all over the place, all through these pages. And so they try to give the unblemished, the unedited version of the opinions of the fathers on these things. And so, and I think they do a really good job. It's good work that they have done, and they do this on all of the books. When they put out their New Testament, the Gospels, they do that for everything in the Gospels. When they put out the epistles and Revelation, they do that, and there's going to be some kind of commentary on pretty much every work, every one that they did. Now, one advantage with this one is that because, I guess, it was made by monastics, they are going to use sources that are pretty reliably Orthodox. And there's a difference there. Even when we talk about patristic fathers, there are patristic fathers who started out as patristic fathers, but who later it became apparent that they were not reliable in their teaching. All right, so that these would be people like Tertullian, who is not considered by the Orthodox Church, some of the other people. And so in some other references that we have, they have these people, and that's the only caution I would say to you. The big one on this is a set, I don't know how many volumes it has. It's the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. And it's probably got 15 or 20. They do the Old Testament, they do the Old New Testament, everything I think is covered. I'm not sure if the Apocrypha are covered or not. I don't believe that they are. But for example, this is the one, in this particular volume it has, they cover the epistles to the Galatians, to the Ephesians, and to the Philippians. And they do the same kind of thing. When they go through this, they will go No, not even just verse by verse. Like this is from Ephesians, from stuff I was looking at a few years ago. They look at chapter 2, verse 8, and so first it's like the phrase that they call sub A, if you will, A underneath 2-8, where it talks about, and they have a lot of good sources. Most of their sources are really good. Ambrose is good. You look at it, you can tell who's good, who you can pay attention to. But then you just want to watch out a little bit. And if you see some of the people, sometimes you'll find people whose teachings may have been condemned at an ecumenical council. Sometimes people that just are not, as time went on, are not really considered reliable. And so you just kind of exercise a little bit of caution when you look at these things. But it really is an excellent thing. It's put together. I think its general editor is a Methodist pastor. And in fact, when I was about to become Orthodox, they used that to try to talk me out of it. They said, "Hey, look, Orthodoxy has the fathers too," and he does a pretty good job with it. But do be a little cautious with it. There are a lot of other sources like that too. But why do I really pick on that? I mean, why do I stress the idea of going to the fathers? And if you read my polemical email yesterday to the parish, you know that one thing that I don't have much respect for, and I think generally speaking, a lot of Orthodox don't, is for what I would think of as academic theologians. People who teach theology in universities or seminaries, mostly non-Orthodox seminaries, who are really just advancing their own agenda. That agenda may be modernistic in the sense of relationships, gay marriages, all kinds of things. A lot of political agendas tend to get kind of caught up in their work, and then what they write or what they will teach is tinged by that, and it becomes a very difficult kind of thing. And even some things that are good at one point can, as time goes on, can become a little less good. For example, there was a really good 2-volume set on the Gospel of John that was written by a Roman Catholic theologian. And the first one that came out in the late 1950s was very good. It's very straightforward. It's very right down the middle. It's good analysis. It's really worth time. But then there was a second edition, so a few decades later, and it is like entirely different. It's so you have to look at some of these things. But a lot of times, that older edition is going to be more valuable than the newer edition. There is the same thing by an Orthodox professor, and I won't mention his name, but we used 2 of his books when I was in seminary, and the first book was real solid, right? And so then a new book comes out. The professor, I think, probably just assumed it was going to be solid too, and assigned it. Everybody got it and started reading it, and there's kind of this classroom rebellion. It's like, this is awful. He's going, what? What do you mean? What do you mean? He said, okay, let me read it. Comes back, he goes, throw it away. And it's so it's kind of sad. We can reach that as well. If we go into reading Scripture and we have a particular agenda of some kind, I mean, it doesn't make a difference what it is, and we want Scripture to comport to us, that if we want it to say and mean the same thing that we want it to mean and say, we can find that. You can find that wherever you want to find it. There's always somebody out there that's going to have that. But for our purposes, every time we study Scripture, we do need understanding, and it's good, and I think it's a praiseworthy thing to go and to get some of these sources and to look and see what the great fathers of the church have said. It's not just St. Joseph Chrysostom, it's Gregory the theologian, it's Gregory of Nyssa, it's so many of those people that just contributed so much over the centuries. They don't always agree, and that's all right. They don't have to agree, but they all are holy people, which is also why we can look at stuff from Saint Theophilus, or we can look at stuff from the 20th, 21st century from holy people, because holiness doesn't change. The saints from way back in the beginning of the church, the holiness that they have is seen in the saints that we have today. They're different people, their circumstances are different, they arrive at that position or that place by different routes, but it's the holiness of the saints is reliable. Sometimes it's hard to understand what they're saying, in which case you probably hold off on that. But certainly it's something that we look for. If a person has been glorified as a saint, his writings or her writings are respected, then that becomes something that you can certainly hold on to. Recently, some more of these things have become easier to get to. For example, St. John Kronstadt, his life, it's like a diary where he talks about this. And until recently, you had to read the whole 400 pages to try and find whatever he was saying about some verse, about some scripture. And then the last edition that came out just in the last couple of years, it's got an index for the scripture that he uses and where it's at. And that makes it a whole lot more accessible. And so hopefully that'll happen in the future. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the history of this book as we know it. I wanted to talk about how we go about reading books like this. And so having done that, next week we'll look at chapter 1 and start talking about the substance of what Paul wrote. So thank you very much. I'll see you guys next week.